Today's guest is no stranger to confronting tyranny. Whether abroad or on the page, Paul Greenberg is a New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, a Pew Fellow, and a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellow. He spent years on the front lines of Russia's failed transition to democracy, giving him a first-hand education in how dictators rise and how democracies fall. His latest work, A Third Term, is a razor-sharp political satire that imagines George Washington being pulled from the past to run against a modern-day tyrant in the 2028 election. But in a world of misinformation and media manipulation, even Washington himself isn't immune to collapse or to falling in love with his personal trainer. Tonight, we're diving into fiction, politics, and what it takes to recognize tyranny before it takes root. Welcome to the show, Paul Greenberg. How's it going, Paul? Welcome.
It's great. Thanks for that great intro. I love the, it was really well edited and voiced.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Like, I'm retired, so
you have some time.
I enjoy it. So why don't we start out by just kind of giving everybody a backdrop, kind of where you came from and how you got to start to become an author in writing.
Sure. So I was, believe it or not, a Soviet studies major, which I think dates me. I think you're probably old enough to know what that even is. But I went to college when Mikhail Gorbachev was coming to power. I remember. Yeah, it was like 87 or something like that. And so, those of us who are of a certain age, we remember growing up under the threat of nuclear annihilation all the time, right? Like there were fallout shelters, there was discussion of, nuclear winter. There were all sorts of kind of scary things all the time. It's a kind of scary time to grow up, actually. So when Gorbachev came to power, and again, for younger listeners, they may not remember, but Gorbachev came in as a reformer, really shook up this old, literally dying Soviet bureaucracy, introduced the concept of glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. And so I was totally excited about this whole thing. And I was like, well, hey, let's be a Soviet studies major. What else could I do? So I learned Russian. And also alongside of that, I went to Brown University, which had a very interesting filmmaking department. It was called the semiotics department. So I made a lot of sort of experimental independent films. And weirdly enough, a lot of people say this of their undergraduate education, that it didn't really prepare them for real life. But my undergraduate education exactly prepared me for real life. And I was hired just a few years out of college by this company called Internews, and they sent me to Russia to help reform Soviet media because by that point, the Soviet Union had collapsed. All these independent TV stations had cropped up everywhere. So I basically was like the Johnny Appleseed of independent media. I went to all these little tiny, TV stations, not unlike what you're sitting in right now. Like literally these guys, and they didn't have the benefit of the internet or digital technology. So, they literally had bunkers where they'd wire up to the general antenna of their communal apartment building and sometimes charge subscriptions. They could turn people on and off in the apartment complex. So anyway, so I did that for a number of years. But deep down, I think of myself as a creative person, and I always wanted to write. And I wrote a novel out of that called Leaving Katya, which is sort of a love story set amidst the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then weirdly, because I fish, you can see my fishing hat, you can see my fishing cup. I actually got the call from first the Boston Globe and the New York Times to start writing sort of think pieces about fishing. And so I got very much into that. I wrote a bestseller called For Fish, wrote 2 more books about the ocean. But, along the way, I did a lot about writing about environmental law, about, the right we all Americans have to our open spaces and things like that. And so when Donald Trump came around the first time, it set off all sorts of, bells and whistles. And in fact, actually, I was a big fighter for something called Bristol Bay in Alaska. Are you a fisherman or a hunter of any kind?
I'm a hunter, but I don't know much about Alaska fishing.
So Bristol Bay is the biggest salmon fishery in the United States, possibly the world. And they wanted to put a giant copper and gold mine on top of it. And I happened on Instagram to see a picture of Donald Trump Jr. with his son fishing in Bristol Bay. Meanwhile, his father had actually given Scott Pruitt, his then EPA director, the go-ahead to proceed with his mine. So I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, and it actually kind of helped grind things to a halt and help save the fishery. I mean, I was one voice among many. And so, that all led me to kind of into the world of politics. And so, I was watching the 2020 election take shape. And I was just seeing all the kind of crazy stuff that was coming out of Trump's mouth about, ammonia as a potential cure and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, gosh, and then, his supporters would just continue to support what he would say no matter what. And it suddenly occurred to me, gosh, if George Washington himself were to come back, I don't know that his supporters would choose Washington over Trump. And that was this little splinter in my head. And I started thinking about it. And for the first time in my life, I've always found love writing. It's my life, but it's hard for me. This was the first book that came to me completely finished into my head. It was like literally the voices were speaking to me. I wrote the book in a month, gave it to my agent. He couldn't sell it. This was 2020. So I put it in a drawer and I thought, okay, well, and then Biden won. I thought, oh, well, done with this. Cut to 4 years later. And then, of course, the same dynamics start again. And a small private foundation approached me and asked me if I would like to publish the book because they had read it in draft form. And I said, sure. So we published it just before the election. Didn't seem to have affected anyone's opinion, but it continues to kind of just make its way. And we just dropped the audio book. It's out in paperback. It's out in Kindle. And I've been making the rounds, and it's been super interesting. And, every time Trump mentions the possibility of his running for a third term, which he does quite a bit, I get renewed interest in this. So I figure this book is going to kind of dribble along for the next 3 or 4 years. Hopefully after 3 years, we'll be done with it, but we'll see. I don't know.
Well, so it's funny when I went through your bio, right? And I seen what you had did with this book. It caught my attention because I wrote a piece for a veteran magazine called At Ease magazine. And what I was doing was comparing presidents that had served the military, which is the leadership style of non-military related president. And you really start to see a kind of an odd trend, until politics basically became a full-time career and that's all people cared about. And the presidents that were joining the military just to put it on their resume. Up until that point, the leadership style was quite different. It was more about the good of the many and keeping America going than it was any one topic necessarily with the White House. And then a non-military guy would come in and it was about building businesses and industry and stuff like that. You do see a weird trend. And when I came across this, I was like, oh, we definitely got to talk. I would love to see a third term with George Washington. I'm not going to.
Well, yeah. And the thing is, of course, I was also influenced quite a bit by Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton, though I never actually saw it. My son saw it, and, he grew up with that musical. And so we were constantly listening to the soundtrack. So, that version of Washington is presented as, just as you say, a very selfless person who thinks of the many versus the one. And I started diving into Washington's character as a general and as a president. And, he was often in private referred to as the general, just like his military identity stayed with him. And so that I use that parlance in the book quite a bit. But it is true. I myself, I didn't serve in the military. You did, I assume, yes?
I did. Yep.
So I didn't serve. My dad was a captain in the Army. So, I'm proximate to it. But what I have found in my dealings with military, and I have dealt with military quite a bit when I worked in Bosnia, for that same organization. It was right after the Serbs were pushed back from the hills of Sarajevo. So we were constantly interacting with military and stuff. And I got a sense of the culture, and the chain of command and all that. But what I found when I went into Washington's biography is that, if you understand that you are responsible for the life and death of people beneath you, that is a whole other order of understanding the universe. And I would think that the best military leaders who then go on to become president or serve in major leadership roles, that they can't just banish that idea from their heads. And that, knowing, the foobar and the snafus that can happen when things go awry, probably every person who's been an officer who's served when things have gone wrong replays that in their mind and thinks about the chain of events that they set forward as leaders that led to somebody dying. And so I think that's how I imagined Washington. And also the last thing I'd say that I imbued militarily into, well, two things. First of all, courage. Washington was an incredibly courageous person. He literally, when he had his main battlefield commands in the French and Indian War, he literally led his troops into musket fire. And when he returned, his battle tunic had holes all through it. And people had no idea how that's possible. My father actually often talked about how you would come across people in the military who just in their heart of hearts just knew that they weren't going to die. And like those kind of people, and maybe they did die eventually, but they had that kind of blood and guts feeling and iron character about them. And I think Washington had that. But on top of it, I think that Washington also was just a man of character. And, you know, if he were held up to present day scrutiny, would his decisions hold up? I don't know. But I think his character would hold up because it's such a silly idea in a certain way of George Washington brought back to run for president in the modern era. I decided in the book to make it his campaign really about character. We've seen in the last 4 months, like 5 months, all the things that have happened. I couldn't possibly tell you where we're going to be in 2028, who will be bombing, who's bombing us, what laws will be rescinding. So I don't even touch that in a third term. I just look at the question of Washington's character versus the tyrant's character.
You know, and that was that when I did my research on him, the one thing that struck me was it seemed like he was ahead of his time because he already knew that the Lord gave him 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And he was very, very good at listening to all of his officers underneath his commands, ideas and everything before he made his final decision.
Yep.
And so I think that would go a long way, even in today's world. It may confuse everybody underneath him, like, why is he actually listening to me? But I think that would be a good thing. Why don't we go and take a second and we'll play the sample? It's about 4 minutes long.
Yeah.
From the book, and we'll listen to how the pace of it goes.
Okay.
George Washington stood in the wings of Madison Square Garden and arranged his sash. There had been much fussing over how he would present himself to the New York crowd, and even some debate over whether or not the delegates would even recognize him. Any live person differs from his portrait, even in photography. The same was true of Washington. His face was decidedly more animated than the later portraits suggested. To complicate matters further, the improvements modern medicine had made upon him were notable. To begin with, his lingering pneumonia had been treated with antibiotics and good color had returned to his complexion. A pustule in his thigh, which had 3 times during his first term broken out into a nearly fatal condition, had been removed, and this long-standing affliction, which had strained his expression every day of his life, was now gone. But by far the most noted improvement concerned the general's mouth. Over the course of his years, first as general and later as president, Washington had enlisted the services of 2 dentists whom he'd taken into his greatest confidence, all for the purpose of addressing his deteriorating dental condition. In the end, only a single bicuspid of his original teeth remained, and this tooth had been tortured cruelly, made to anchor a set of dentures fashioned from other human teeth implanted in hippopotamus bone, which were in turn enabled to open and close through the intervention of a gold spring. This, to the dentists of 2028, was a work of steampunk. So gruesome and yet so ingenious was its design that they photographed it with their phones and saved the pictures for a time when it would be permitted to discuss their illustrious patient. Removing the last bicuspid, which was quite rotten by this point, the rehabilitation team had spared no expense fitting the general with a set of implants that matched perfectly his jawline and restored what would have been his natural profile. So much so that when the dentists finally finished, Washington's famously jutting lower jaw jutted no more. Nearly every day that he woke and felt no oral pain, Washington dropped to his knees and thanked the Creator tearfully. In the final years of his former life, Washington had been known for the stilted qualities of his speech, but no one had really known how much of this reticence had stemmed from the issue that the simple act of moving his jaws was profoundly painful. Sibilant sounds, the lovely S's, sh's, and zh's, were particularly hard to enunciate, and he had by the end of his second term come to excise whole lexicons from his public discourse to avoid the most troublesome consonant clusters. Now, in the wings of the garden, he felt that reticence lift. He could say literally anything he wanted without fear of his teeth falling out, or of aspirating a word he wished to use as a steady anchor for the next sentence. He felt, in short, nearly the same as he felt when addressing his troops when he first took up a battlefield commission against the French in '54. When the curtain parted, he heard the old fife and drum music played over a loudspeaker, and then strode to the center of the stage, remembering his blocking precisely, giving the profile that would be the most recognizable to the majority of latter-day Americans. Laughter punctuated the arena on one side, the crowd sensing perhaps a late-night comedian brought out to lighten the atmosphere. But on another side of the arena, A gasp went out, and then all at once, applause rippled across the venue as Washington moved closer to the edge of the stage, smiled a broad smile with his new dentures, and began his address. My friends, my good fellow citizens, my brethren in love of liberty, it is no less a surprise that I find myself here than you would have found in presupposing my presence. I have come hence tonight at the behest of this democratic faction to intervene at a moment of tyranny. Those that preside over this faction saw fit to summon me from the mansions of rest so that I might impartially and without want of personal gain guide you through this particular storm toward a safer shore. That at least was the hope presented to me. Here, Washington paused and looked through the stage lights at the 20,000 odd delegates and hangers-on that had gathered to anoint a nominee. There was a rapt, puzzled silence.
So, it's funny. I was listening to that speech, and that's the thing that got me the most was just picturing if this was his term right after Trump, right? Different the speeches went. Trump says he died like a dog. And then you got this guy. It's like, hey, look, I'm here. I'm impartial. I'm just here to clean up the mess.
Yeah. Yeah. And, as readers will hopefully see when they read the book, that's the tussle, right? Is that, character, as I'm sure you witnessed in the military, is not immediately apparent, and that, sometimes the most blustery people that might have just come out of West Point or whatever will make the stupidest mistakes, because they're just full of themselves. They're full of their own ego and stuff like that. But people who have a really deep character based in deep experience of suffering, of loss, and so forth, that is a very quiet thing that kind of bubbles up. And I think that's sort of what I imagined Washington having, so there's all this media noise that he has to deal with. There's all this and let's face it, in the book, he's called the tyrant, and we can just refer to him as this. Our particular tyrant is very gifted in this respect, and this ability to kind of almost troll through the American brain with a fine mesh net and figure out what words are going to trigger people and get people excited. When you go back, you're talking about the juxtaposition of somebody from then versus somebody now, like the Lincoln-Douglas debates lasted hours. And because people, their brains hadn't been rotted by scrolling through Instagram and so forth, they could follow the tendrils of a complicated argument. And so to some degree, that's what Washington has to fight with in order to kind of beat the tyrant.
Yeah. And to be honest, back then, let's face it, the people that were voting, they took that serious. I mean, they had fought for that right to do it, and they all knew somebody that had died. So they wanted to hear what was going to be done and what they were going to be doing because they knew it directly affected them. And in today's world, good luck on getting the ship to stand there for an hour and a half and listen to a speech.
That's right. Right. Yeah. And I think, I don't know. I think the other thing is that Washington could smell lack of character in others, and that's the other thing I was trying to set up is that, I think we've seen in this president that there's just this constant need for affirmation. I don't know if you read the news today about the NATO summit where, pardon?
I have not. I've been editing videos all mornings.
Better use of your time. But, the head of NATO, a German, sort of went out of his way to kind of endlessly genuflect and bow down to the president and all this. And there's a piece in the New Yorker about it where the writer talks about how our president's character is such that, and maybe it stems from lack of parental approval as a child or whatever, but it seems a bottomless pit of needing affirmation from the outside and proof that you are in fact a good person and a strong person. And one of the things that gets under the tyrant's skin in this book is that there's just no way that he can outdo Washington. There's no argument. And no matter where he looks, no matter how many things he's named after himself on every single quarter, every single dollar bill, he's looking at his ultimately more successful rival. So, that's kind of thing. The other thing that and why the book is called A Third Term, it's slightly deeper than just simply, what if this president gets a third term? It's more, when you think about it, Washington set the precedent of only 2 terms. And, people seem to think that was somehow in the original draft of the Constitution, but it was not. Washington willfully stepped down, partially because he was exhausted, partially, keep in mind, he was in command for years, decades, really. And that's exhausting. And, and as the audio excerpt shows was sick, was literally physically in pain all the time. So he gave it up. He wanted to give it up. And the Washington in my book doesn't really want it again. Like he's kind of dragged kicking and screaming. And meanwhile, the tyrant, all he wants is more. All he wants, he doesn't want it for the sake of helping people. He wants it for the sake of having it. So I thought that was a funny kind of collision of things.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: when you were building out the base, did it just come to you and say this character has to be George Washington, or did you look at Hamilton, or even somebody like Roosevelt that was very anti-business?
Yeah. It's a really good question. Lincoln comes to mind. I think at one point in the book they do. Washington himself gets a little bit heated when discussions of Lincoln come up, and he just refers to him as the backwoods lawyer Lincoln. And so it's fun to play with historical characters, like moving around the chessboard.
Yeah.
But I did think a little bit about it, but I also thought that there's something about it being the first president. I also think it's funny there, because of my Soviet background, I know these weird things, but there were a couple of Soviet emigres who did a funny thought experiment where they started making paintings based on sociological surveys of people in the country. So, like, for example, they would ask people, like, what do they want in a painting? And they asked this in different countries. And Americans, they wanted the color blue, they wanted some wildlife, and they wanted a founding father, preferably Washington. And then they created a painting. And if you Google this, you can see them. They created a painting with Washington and a deer and a river and a blue sky. So I think that Washington is just very, very fundamental. I think, I will say that, I wrote the book and tried to sell it during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. And you may recall from those days that Washington and all the founding fathers, anyone who had been a slave owner, was sort of hauled up the yardarms and castigated for it. I didn't like that. I just thought that was a kind of irrelevant argument to make. And I stuck by my guns. And 4 years later, I think people start to see the kind of over the topness of that. I ended up, going with Washington. It's funny because people, so all my other books were published by Penguin Press, one I published independently. And I've been working with, so that's a whole other interesting side story, but I've been working with a team of digital marketers who are particularly adept at kind of gaming the Amazon algorithm. And one of the things that my consultants keep telling me is that, you'll do much better if this is a series. And I'm like, a series? What's the next chapter? But then it actually occurred to me, so as readers will see when they read the book, Washington comes to us via something called the anomaly. There's some sort of anomaly that we can see coming around the backside of Mars or whatever. Not much is said of it. But then it occurred to me, maybe I should do a series called The Anomaly. Each little book is just somebody comes back to solve a particular problem. So maybe,
even tie in the CIA. It's a dark military secret that they discovered how to do it. And so the CIA was bringing these people back.
Well, since you seem to be a student of the military, like, who would you like to see come back from the past?
Well, I do like Washington out of the majority. Who was the next military one? It was not Hamilton.
Hamilton wasn't president, but it was after Washington comes Adams, and then we get Jefferson.
Jefferson, I believe, was the next military, and Adams was not, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't believe so. I think they were all, it's like the funny thing about, I think about the founding fathers the way I think about people from Alaska. Mm-hmm. Almost everyone I've ever met in Alaska knows how to build a house with their own hands, and I think that's like, we take it for granted that, these were frontier people. Even if you had a big plantation, you knew how to do shit. And, in the course of, I had a temporary appointment down at Duke University in the summertime. And so on the way down, we went to Monticello. And on the way back, we went to Mount Vernon. And both cases, yes, there were slaves for sure. They were doing the majority of the work. But the plantation owner was doing stuff and knew about all these kind of different aspects of things. Whereas, we today don't seem to know how to do anything.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is definitely a different world. And I would love to see this actually happen. I would change from being politically homeless to actually caring what they have to say if I could see something like this.
Yeah, well, we are, so the other thing that's going on with this, we got a second grant to kind of promote the book and so forth. And actually I commissioned a screenplay that an Emmy Award-winning writer is writing as we speak. So you may not actually see it in reality, but in my fantasy, George Clooney plays Washington, and maybe even J-Lo comes back and plays his personal trainer. I don't know if you ever saw that movie Out of Sight, but they had such chemistry. But in my vision of the film, as the passage alludes to that you played, Washington, when he's brought back, is actually quite feeble. He's literally snatched from his deathbed. He's got this pustule in his thigh. His teeth are a wreck. He's got pneumonia. And so what I'd like to see is like Clooney looking terrible, which we never see, and when he comes back, he's looking terrible. He's a wreck. And that in the course of the film, Clooney emerges as Clooney, but Clooney as Washington rather. And so if we could ever pull that off, that would be great.
With all the digital work out there, I'm sure they could, make him look digitally weathered.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this: when you talk about the satirical elements, how do you balance the humor with kind of the warning that you're putting out?
Well, nobody likes a lecture, right? And there is this Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina. He employed a device in Russian, it's called ostranение. It means to make things strange. And so he'll often have something unfold before the eyes of a child. And so she's able to express, like in War and Peace, Natasha Rostova, the main character, that she gets taken to a play, and it's a terrible play, and only she can see how fake and stupid it is. And so it's this way of kind of showing how ridiculous everything has become. So Washington is kind of Natasha Rostova in this case, in that he's taking in this bizarre situation, where he has to kind of step up. I mean, so the passage that you played is just before he steps onto the stage at the Democratic National Convention in 2028. Going into it, to the delegates, so nobody knows about Washington. It's the Democratic Party machine is grinding ahead as usual, and they've come to New York in 2028, and it's locked. It's deadlocked. And between one guy, I can't remember, I think he's called Reuter Van something or other, but he's like the scion of a wealthy Chicago real estate family. He looks great, and he's an absolute idiot. And then this rival is this candidate named Jay Henton Syed, who is a they. We don't even really know their ethnicity. We don't really even know their policies, because identity has taken over the whole question of policies and character and stuff like that. So looked at through Washington's eyes, you see this insanity of the Democratic Party, which I think we're seeing still. Everyone crying out. And I'm a left wing. I should say, I have historically voted Democrat, but I'm just like blown away by the idiocy where you have this election which clearly shows that what's on people's table is bread and butter issues of, economic stability, all these kinds of things. And then the first thing that Kamala Harris does, publicly, is go to the wedding of Huma and a Soros person at a giant wedding, probably a 6 or 7 figure wedding. It's just like, what? And you're thinking about a political comeback? Like how, and going to this event, and what are you thinking? So I think, like you mentioned at the top of the interview, that a military leader looks for the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's what's happening with either party at the present time. You mentioned you were politically homeless, and I appreciate that. Because, what happens with ossified political parties, and, Hamilton actually argued against political parties. In the Federalist Papers, one of the Federalist Papers is about parties, about political parties, because they become these machines that grind out these products that aren't really people, that just hit a tin drum to kind of rally people around something that they don't necessarily even believe in.
That was one of the bigger arguments, I believe, that Adams and Hamilton had. Because the more I thought about it, Hamilton was like the treasurer or something.
Treasury secretary.
So, even though Washington was part of that party, he really didn't do anything with it. He wasn't a big fan either of it. He kind of felt like it got in the way of doing what he felt was right versus what should be done.
Yeah. And I think early on, we still see it played out, but I think the main debate of the post-revolutionary period was the question of a federalist state where, a central bank, federal institutions versus Articles of Confederation type government where the states have more power. So, that drew the lines right there. But you could see in another world where that didn't necessarily have to be assigned to one party or another. Like if you are just two people instead of two parties reasoning through your own personal lens to why one way or another way would be preferable, to me, that's much more honest. You know what I mean? And this whole question of the party platform and all these kinds of things, it just sort of pins you to these funny things. Like, you as a hunter, I don't know if you've been following this whole question of privatizing public lands, and it's recently come up in this bill that's before Congress at the moment, the big, beautiful bill. One of the provisions is to sell off public land, supposedly for affordable housing, but the question of it actually being used for that, I think, is really unlikely. But you as a hunter and me as a fisherman, the idea of public land should be sacrosanct, the ability to go get your food, engage with wilderness. And nobody ever, would have personally put that into a bill. But when you have interests, political interests, sort of sitting on this thing called a party platform, then these things get shoved down our throats that the majority of us don't want.
Yeah, I think you could probably, if you took and you said, okay, look, I'm gonna make the very, very far right, the Republicans, and the very, very far left, the Democrats, you could literally start another party for the 80% that's in the middle. Because most of us have some Democrat views and we have some Republican views. We're in this common sense era.
Yeah.
And then you got the people on the outside where we're both going, what the hell?
What the hell? Exactly. And, and most of us just want to live our lives and not be messed with, but also to have basic rights protected.
Yeah.
To, have a country that, we can feel proud of. So, going back to it, I think Washington would have seen it. I don't know. In the context of my novel, he sees it. And it's in a way like there are a couple moments in the book when he is actually ready to cut and run and not do this again. But I think it's his call to duty that maybe makes him think that it is his duty to try and do this. Yeah. And, I think we've lost a lot of that. I admire you, for having served. And I think, I don't know that I would put a draft, a standing draft or a peacetime draft on the American public. But I do think the idea of mandatory service of some kind is really important. When I was in university, took a year off, and I worked for this fabulous organization called the Student Conservation Association. Mm-hmm. And what it did is it gave you, the grand sum of $40 a week in food, and they gave you some housing. And I lived in Eugene, Oregon, and every day I worked for the Bureau of Land Management and counted salmon and steelhead, and just walked up and down the rivers of the Coast Range, back and forth all day long, getting so soaked that they literally had to wring me out by the time I was finished. But that service, I never had known a government employee before, really. I'd never known what that was about. And I'd never worked basically as a volunteer before, because $40, nobody's putting any money in the bank for $40 a week. So, so I do think that service is, and it's funny because I think, I don't know if you have kids, but my son just went through the whole kind of college application process, and he's a freshman now, or he's going to be a sophomore actually. But there's so much in that sort of dog eat dog world to get into college. There's all this like mock service where people, maybe they might do volunteer at a food bank or da. But most people do it to put a check on their resume rather than finding their inner selfless person. And it's funny, I have a buddy of mine from a Soviet studies days, her daughter, who truly believes in meritocracy and truly believes in the volunteer work she does. I'm helping her write an op-ed, hopefully for the New York Times, about fake volunteerism, which abounds, And so, it's a real tough problem. Like, how do we imbue youth with a sense of the necessity of service? What made you go into the military back in the day?
So me and my wife started dating in 7th grade, and I got married literally a month after high school.
Wow.
And so I was working as a mechanic. I didn't have the money for college, and I just needed skills. Nobody really wanted to hire a 18, 19-year-old kid. So I joined the military back then. It was 94. And it was literally a 9-to-5 job. I was like, well, I'll come in. I'll get some college money. It was all selfless reasons. I didn't come in because I wanted to, like the kids nowadays after 9/11, I got a lot of respect for those guys because they came in knowing what they were going into.
Yeah.
So I think that's great, And I do got some beef with the government. I do watch the news most mornings while I'm waking up. What's affecting the veterans out there? Are we sending our troops somewhere? Is there fighting? Because I got an issue with the government, and my biggest issue is I did 20 years, so I retired in 2014. But out of that time, I spent 68 months between Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. That's over 20% of my career was spent fighting for my life.
Yeah.
They wonder why we've got so many problems. You just can't keep sending people. And there should be a law about how much you can put a soldier in there. At some point, he's had enough feet on the ground and experience that he's more valuable training troops than he is continuously tearing his mental health to crap.
Yeah. What years? Can I ask you, when were you in Bosnia?
96.
Yep.
So it was that was back when it was S4.
Yes, that's right. Well, we were probably traipsing around at the same time, because I was in and out of Sarajevo and all around from 96 to 98. So,
Yeah.
and I do remember the S4 troops.
To this day, I can't remember what I did last week, but for whatever reason, I still know how to say in Bosnian, stop, I'll shoot. And I know what the word for candy is, bon bon.
Yeah.
The kids would say it all the time, man. They would stand at the edge of our guard towers. Give me bon bon, give me bon bon.
And, that's actually, I thought Bosnia is a fascinating place and sad place, in the sense of, like, you really see what happens when a country tears itself up. As listeners may or may not know, once upon a time there was this country called Yugoslavia. And do you know that the war in Yugoslavia started in a soccer match? Apparently it was a Croatia versus Serbia soccer match that it devolved into a riot, and then it went military. And then, first there was the war between Serbia and Croatia, and then Bosnia, which was so multi-ethnic, tore itself apart. There's a joke I remember somebody telling me, why didn't Bosnia fight in the first part of the Yugoslav war? Answer is they went directly to the finals, which they did. But and then going back again to my book, and what I'm trying to say is that, there is nothing worth tearing your country apart. And I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it in Bosnia. I saw it in the West Bank and Gaza. To some degree, I saw it in Tajikistan and Georgia, Azerbaijan. And these politicians that talk this inflammatory language don't realize they're literally playing with fire. And it's not appropriate for a leader who wants to run his government. And going back to the premise you opened the interview with, a leader should be somebody who is for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And if you're constantly speaking to 39% of the population and not 100%, or at least 90, then you're not doing your job as a leader. So, tough times. So, I applaud your work abroad all those times. So you were in Afghanistan as well?
I was. That's where I spent the majority of my time was Afghanistan. I did 3 tours. I can't remember exactly how many to Iraq.
Yeah.
But the majority of my time was Afghanistan. And what you were saying earlier is exactly right. Because, everybody asks me, what is Bosnia like? And I tell them, I said, it's crazy, because I drove from Tazar, Hungary, all the way to Bosnia.
Yeah.
And when you go through Croatia, it is just a beautiful place. We're driving down the road and people are coming out of their houses waving. And I remember seeing all these girls wearing these dresses like a Little House on the Prairie. That's exactly what it kind of looked like. And then it was like toothpaste stopped right there at the bridge. And when you went over into Bosnia, like the first thing I remember seeing was a school that had these like 50 cal round holes in it. So I seen people like burning their grass to try to stay warm. It was crazy.
And around Sarajevo, the way they toppled over trams and buses as barricades. And and you could see the ethnic, you hear the term ethnic cleansing, but you could look at the house it's like Croat, Serb, Muslims, and then it was reversed in, whatever other town you might have been in. And I think, the other thing that, and I'm sure you realize this, to reverse that, right, to get back to a point where people tolerate each other after they've killed each other is so difficult. And, my personal mission there, or the work that Internews did and the work that I did in Bosnia, was reconstructive. We had funding from the now defunct USAID to do TV programs that were integrative. So I produced a Bosnia-wide TV magazine called Fresh, where we had Croat Serbs and Bosnian Muslims making the same TV show together. and getting people back to where they have a shared vision of reality, it's really, really hard. And it may not even be possible for the generation that went through that, and that the only hope might lie with the next generation. And we certainly don't want to get to that point in this country.
Yeah, that was like, again, there's just so many people that don't understand, the things that I seen over there that really just kind of like made you be thankful as a father. By the time I went over there, I had youngins. The kids never walked on grass. If it wasn't concrete, they did not walk on it. If it was a mud puddle, they didn't walk through it. And you're like, man, that is kids, jumping in mud puddles and running, getting muddy in the grass, and
because of the landmines.
Yeah. There was 1.5 million when we were over there.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have this, but to this day, if there's a choice between walking on grass or asphalt, I just default to the asphalt. It's really funny. And yeah.
The training over there, they teach you that if you're walking and you hear boom, do not dive on the ground, because it's not a missile. It's a landmine, more than likely, right?
Yeah.
They'd freeze. But then I went to Iraq and Afghanistan, and it took me a while to get that training out of my mind. And I would hear an explosion and I'd be stuck in this like half crunch, dive, stand up. What am I supposed to do? Yeah. It's just such different worlds over there.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is. Yeah. Our biggest part was, and people don't understand, the government had been destroyed, and so when we were over there, they were trying to stand there was a government in place, but that we're trying to enforce the policies and laws again. So, no, this was in Bosnia. My big picture, my big image of what I had to do over there was I worked with the scout platoons, and we had checkpoints. And if cars came through with the wrong license plates, we would tow them and take them back to the Bosnian military place, and then they would have to go down and actually register their vehicles and so forth. So that's what I did for a long time.
Just to explain to listeners, I think you're referring to, as I recall, license plates were a form of ethnic identity. Right. And in the old license plates, you would have three letters, three numbers, and in the middle, a symbol that indicated whether you were Bosnian Muslim, Croat, or Serb. Yeah. And I think S4, and I think the international community got rid of that. And you had to have numbers, and then you had to have letters that were the same in the Cyrillic alphabet as they were in the English alphabet. Or in other words, you couldn't have something that was exclusively a Cyrillic letter. And so that was an attempt at trying to reestablish freedom of movement. And we had to do that. What were we Americans had to do that.
Yeah, it is just insane. We had kids, how do you teach kids that have nothing? And all they want is some candy, and they think if they help you, they're going to get some candies. We had kids that would be bringing up like Russian grenades that they found and trying to bring them to us. And here we are screaming at them, telling them, stop, put it down. We don't want to shoot you. And, you're just like, please understand what I'm saying. Those kids grew up, by the time they were 10, they were probably the same maturity as an 18-year-old in America. And it is tough to watch that happen.
Yep.
It makes you thankful.
It sure does. Well, you're one person who certainly earned his retirement. So I hope you're enjoying it. I always remember being out on a fishing boat maybe 10, 15 years ago. There was a real old geezer on the boat, and it was pretty rough. I was like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm retired. And, it was really rough, and people were throwing up. And I was like, you enjoying your retirement? And he looks at me, he goes, I enjoy every golden day. And he, totally heartfelt.
Yeah. I started a nonprofit for veterans, and I work that full time, and I podcast. This podcast started out as therapy for me. I didn't realize that's what was going to happen, but by the end of the season 1, I realized I was talking about things that I didn't normally talk about.
Yeah.
I've been doing it ever since, and I rebranded the name to be a little bit more politically correct. Or when I started the Veteran Voice Radio, it used to be called Two Drunk Dudes in a Gun Room. And let me tell you, I would get mail all the time, Facebook, Instagram, and it was either you loved it or you hated it. There was no middle ground, that name. But people just didn't understand. That was just veteran humor. It wasn't me saying you should get drunk and start playing with guns in a gun room. It was just a few things that veterans found. And the show was just a Facebook Live show. It was just us bringing our soldiers back. We had a couple that had committed suicide. And so it was really just for the people we served with. It wasn't for everybody. I didn't expect it to take off, and people just started spreading it, and it just grew.
It's great. Well, and going back to, you had asked me earlier, why did I choose Washington? In a way, it's the same story. It's like nobody argues with Washington. Believe it or not, there are still people in this country who take offense at the name of Abraham Lincoln, who see it as an affront to the South and all that kind of thing. But I think, there's a point at which a name becomes more than a person. It becomes almost a kind of a brand. And I think when people think about Washington, they think of truth. They think of the cherry tree, whether it's true or not. Apparently it might be apocryphal. Who knows? I think they think of strong leadership. They think of impartiality. They do now more and more think about slavery. But, I think and just to tease it for readers, I do, get into the slavery thing a bit. And when they bring him back, there's the sort of secondary character in the book is a guy named Robert Tonnelly, who's a kind of campaign manager. He's kind of a campaign magician, kind of along the lines of like David Axelrod or David Plouffe, who, shepherded Obama in. But early on, he and his number two are having this conversation just before Washington wakes up. It's like, well, are you sure about this? Like, do we need to game out this whole slavery issue? And Tonnelly, the campaign manager, says, are you kidding? Slavery is the last thing that's going to get brought up by the other side's never going to bring up slavery. So as readers will see, it does get brought up. And so it is, it is something I do believe that slavery is something that we continue to have to grapple with as a country. It underpins a lot of our thinking about the world. But, we are ostensibly a country that believes at our root in liberty. And if we're going to put our money where our mouth is, then we have to grapple with that and figure out liberty and respect for all Americans.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I was stationed in Qatar for a while. And if you want to see human trafficking and tell me it doesn't exist, go to Qatar. And you will see really quick that it does fully exist, and all that is the modern. It's slavery with a very minute wage. Is really all that is.
That's right. And in my world of I write a lot about fisheries, and there's this whole phenomenon of sea slavery. One of the reasons that we still in America sometimes can enjoy cheap fish, particularly things like tuna, is that these ships they have labor brokers at shore in, say, Thailand, or I think the Rohingya minority in Burma was particularly susceptible to this. And they'd say, we'll offer you a great job, So they sign your papers, you get on the ship, they take your passport, and boom, 3 years later, you're basically barely getting paid. And you're a slave. So, yeah, I mean, and there are some people reporting on it, but, it's one of the reasons people come to this country. Let's face it. It's like, and I know there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment at the moment. But, we are, for better or for worse, as advertised, a country that seems to want to allow people to realize their own liberty. And that's a powerful force. Who wouldn't want to come to try and get a piece of that,
No, you're absolutely right. And a lot of people that are complaining and talking about stuff like this right now, they really don't even know the true details about how a lot of that stuff worked, about how migrant working visas and stuff like that. Actually, there's things out there where you don't have to wait years to get a visa. If you're just coming over to be a worker and then you're going back home, there's specific visas for that. If you're trying to get citizenship, now that's a whole nother world. That's you're talking years down the road. But I think the big thing is that's really changed. It's not so much the government as much as the people. We've got all of this technology, and the moment 15 seconds after something happens in the world knows about it. But yet the people back then that had to wait weeks for a newspaper to come out were more educated about the government and things than what we are today.
That's right.
And that is kind of sad that we have allowed ourselves to get to that point.
Yep. Well, I think that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I think to some degree, this is a very short book. It's 100 pages in all. And so it's fairly low buy-in time-wise for people to get involved with it. But just like Hamilton, the musical, was this, what's amazing about Hamilton is that every child I know who went through the whole Hamilton musical experience can tell you the difference between can tell you about the establishment of the National Bank. Such an obscure fact, but it was made into a rap number in Hamilton. So, this is my little contribution to let's all read the Constitution. How about that? Sorry. Let's understand the values that we're trying to defend. And then once we've kind of, beefed up our knowledge about what our system actually is, then let's debate. But let's not kind of go in guns blazing with my point of view before understanding what it is that, underlies and underpins everything. So anyway, listen, I should probably bounce, but thanks for talking. It was a really interesting, lovely conversation. I really enjoyed hearing about your experiences.
Absolutely. And I'm definitely going to get the book because I definitely want to read it. So I think a lot of people will find it the way you're tying it in. I don't know if you ever heard it real quick, but the on YouTube, there used to be these old battle raps that they used to do. And it was like Benjamin Franklin versus, Abraham Lincoln. But it was kind of the same thing. They were kind of educating you a little bit about those eras and they were using it against each other.
Yeah.
But this might be the way it takes to educate some people.
The ultimate battle rap, Washington versus a certain person in 2028.
There you go. There you go. Well,
Anyway.
I appreciate you coming on, and I'm going to throw the exit video out. And anytime you have a new book coming out and you want to promote it, you are more than welcome to reach out to me and we'll get you back on.
Thank you so much, Don, and enjoy your retirement. You earned it.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.